Thank you, Maria. I'd like to introduce Félix Matos Rodríguez, Chancellor of the City University of New York. It is my pleasure to introduce you. Chancellor Matos is a noted author, educator, administrator, trailblazer, innovator, who has received many accolades during his career. I would like to highlight one item that I found most interesting is that during his time at Hostos, he dramatically increased retention and graduation. The two are very important. And so I'd like to welcome Chancellor Matos, please.
Here, right?
Yeah.
I just want to make sure that I got my marching orders. Thank you so much, and thank you to all of you for joining us today. I have the task of moderating a panel of some amazing folks, and then also engage the audience in some Q&A. So let me just Let me call María Enchautegui to join us here at the front, and you already heard from Maria. And as we were told at the beginning, all the bios are included in the materials that you got today. So we want to use the time for conversation. We're going to begin with each of the speakers giving 5 minutes of a little background of what they do. Maria, and that was not my decision, would not be given the 5 minutes because they said they gave her 20 to make the presentation. So that was not the moderator's prerogative. I just want to make sure that we get that. We also have Kimberley Causey-Gomez, the Commissioner Designee. Hi, bienvenida. Yes, from the Department of Human Services of the U.S. Virgin Islands, so welcome. We have also Irwin Redlener from the Mailman School of Public Health at Columbia, coming all the way from, and Leticia Peguero, who is the Vice President of Programs at the Nathan Cummings Foundation. So, bienvenida, Leticia, good to see you. Yes. So as I said, why don't we go and make it easy? We go this way, right? And we, you have the, she's keeping the sign of the 5 minutes, right?
Who's that?
She is. And just give us a little bit sense of, who you are, your connection to this work, and so that the audience gets a sense of your trajectory.
Great, thanks. I'm Irwin Redlener. I'm a pediatrician by background, and I'm the director of the National Center for Disaster Preparedness at Columbia University's Earth Institute, and I'm a co-founder and president emeritus of Children's Health Fund, an organization co-founded by myself, the singer Paul Simon, and my wife Karen in 1987. And we do healthcare for extremely medically underserved children in New York City and around the country. And that's what I do. And recently, let's say since Hurricane Maria, I've been responsible, myself and my team, for the distribution of about $6 million raised by Mark Anthony for helping humanitarian efforts and long-term recovery projects in Puerto Rico and in the region. So that's what I do. I also have teams that are working on other programs for children in Puerto Rico as well. And I have time to make a few points, though, don't I? I mean, okay. So here's what the first thing I want to say is that if you have a place that is already at very high rates of poverty, and especially child poverty, a major disaster is a tremendous backward step. Making progress in economic development and the other things that the reduction of child poverty and so on, takes a major hit when a mega disaster strikes that particular area, which is exactly what happened in 2017 when Hurricane Maria hit the island. A very poor, struggling set of communities on this wonderful island took a hit that has set them back. I won't even get into this second round of trauma experienced by people suffering from the various earthquakes. I will just tell you that the emotional trauma is deeply complicated by the fact that there's been a second major event there. So mega disasters are disasters that cannot be handled by the local community that is affected by the disaster, and it requires an enormous amount of input and resources, support from outside that region. And that, of course, was certainly the case with Hurricane Maria, as it was with Hurricane Harvey in Texas, Hurricane Michael in Florida, and so on. But particularly concerning in Puerto Rico because of the high level of pre-existing poverty, infrastructure fragility, and so on. Mega disasters are obviously catastrophic events for a community, but one of the points I want to make is that whatever happens to the community and the individuals in it, and no matter how many fatalities there are and people who suffer and so on, the fact of the matter is that the impact on children is multiple times the impact on an adult. There's a lot that I could probably tolerate just by myself, as the case for many of you, but what's tolerable for a small child or a school-age child in the aftermath of a major catastrophic event like Hurricane Maria is an entirely different situation. Because the things that happen to children, not so much in the initial impact, but in long, slow, slogging, ineffective recovery, can be damaging in a lifelong sense. So I just want to tell you a couple of things that happen with respect to children. There's many data points, but before the storm, there were 267 schools scheduled to be closed in Puerto Rico. After the storm, an additional 263 schools were closed. And what does that mean? Well, kids under the age of 5 missed, on average, 92 days over the subsequent year of daycare or preschool. School-age children aged 5 to 17 missed 92 days of school in the following year. And many, many children in that level of range missed special ed programs that they desperately needed. So you could say, well, that's a horrible thing to have happened to children right after the hurricane. But it's worse than you think, because the academic impact is, for many children, not recoverable. If a kid can't read in third grade at the level that they're supposed to be reading, it's highly likely that will be the case in the 8th grade. They'll be way behind academically, and a much higher probability they won't graduate from high school on time. So the things that happen in the aftermath of a hurricane in an impoverished community have a very, very long tail when it comes to children. Conversely, I've been talking in this way about children and disasters and the recovery from disasters. Children are the bellwethers of recovery of a community. In other words, if children are doing okay in the aftermath of a big disaster, it's likely that the entire community is doing okay. Wrap up, I got it. And what do I mean by okay? Back to a normal life, in stable housing, going to school, parents stable, family income, doing okay. And that's what's often missing. And the last point I will just make is that big disaster happens, and obviously our first concern is our children, everybody else, surviving the initial impact. But after surviving, immediately comes, are we setting things up so they'll succeed in life? And it's not just success, it's actually we'll be able to find ways to have children actually thrive, which is the key to long-term recovery of any community and any country for that matter. So I'll hold it at that.
Thank you so much, and we'll come back to some of the other things later as we integrate everybody. So, Commissioner, I think I also want you to give you a special opportunity, because I think that as much, and I know that in the audience we have a large number of Puerto Ricans, people from Puerto Rico, and as much as we like to say with some element of truth that we are often neglected, I find that the U.S. Virgin Islands often even, is neglected even more, and that many of the same, at least from the natural disaster side of the equation, occurred also to the islands, and there's a lot less attention to the situation there. So I wanted to make sure that you get a chance, right, to make the case for the situation in the U.S. Virgin Islands. So please go ahead.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kimberley Causey-Gomez, and I'm the Commissioner for the Virgin Islands Department of Human Services. First and foremost, I am a mom, and I think that that's a really important part to bring to this. I'm a single mom. My son is 20, and he's a Lance Corporal in the Marine Corps, and he is on active duty military. It's 1% of our population that actually serves. And so as a mother, it's important for me to mention that because I raised my children as a social worker by heart. And so when my son decided to leave his military college paid for to go active duty, my thought process was, what are you thinking? What is wrong? But the service part, he said, Mom, you taught me to serve. And I think that that's an important part to bring into this equation. I also have a 17-year-old daughter that's graduating from high school who's completely different than her brother. She's very bohemian-ish, very completely artsy. And so the two extremes. I also have a foster daughter who is 26, and she's living in Florida and is married. So I bring that to the attention because it has been a struggle for me to get to where I am now as Commissioner for Department of Human Services. I wasn't raised in the Virgin Islands. I went there when I was 24, and I was a missionary, and I was actually a social worker in a residential facility for abuse and neglect. And that's where I met my daughter. She was only 2 months old, my oldest foster daughter. And I grew up in the Virgin Islands and serving. And because of that, I've seen every aspect that you can think of in the Virgin Islands, especially St. Croix, because this is my home island that I live on. I've been in every community and household, and I had the privilege and the opportunity to not only work for government, also private nonprofit, and that includes Lutheran Social Services and Catholic Charities. And those programs that we served, served our most vulnerable populations. And recently, as my friends here spoke of, I was living in the States. I left the Virgin Islands for a temporary moment, and when the new governor came in, he asked me, would you come back home to serve? And I was like, human services is not in a good space right now. Are you sure this is that this is a good catalyst for change? And he was like, yes, I'm positive. And so for me, it's an uphill battle. And the reason it is because of the 2017 trauma that we experienced. So we didn't just have Maria, we had Irma. So Irma came, destroyed St. Thomas. And a couple of weeks later, Maria came. And Maria came and then hit St. Croix. But right before those 2 weeks, what do you think St. Croix did for St. Thomas? St. Croix gave all their resources to St. Thomas to help our sister island. And then when the hurricane impacted St. Croix, where were our resources? They were now in St. Thomas and St. John. And so then that impact of not only my staff, my employees, my family, serving the people of the Virgin Islands, our most vulnerable populations, they had to get up every day and do that, but they also had to go back home with no roof. And so the trauma, they never got to heal. And so any little bit of rain now reinstates our trauma for our families. A little bit of rain, doesn't even have to be a named storm, brings back those memories of, oh my gosh, I need to do this, something's happening. And it is true that our children are the most vulnerable, but they're also the most resilient. So if we can heal them, then families can continue to be healed and move forward. So the challenge for me and children living in poverty is that impact and what they look like when they come to school. And they're very honest little people. You do realize that. So I also have the opportunity to run Head Start. And when I'm having a bad day, where do you think I go? I go right into the classroom for a site visit. No, I go to eat lunch and hang out to see exactly what's happening. And they tell you everything. They tell you exactly what's happening in their home. They tell you what they got to eat. They tell you where they live. They tell you all about their mommies and their daddies and their brothers and sisters. They're very honest. And that's why you can get that information. You can get that intel. You don't have to have data and statistics because they'll tell you exactly what is happening. So for me, the Virgin Islands is right now very marginalized. We are kind of left out of a lot of things, especially when it comes to federal funds. But our islands are beautiful, and we are resilient, and we are going to come back. And I feel, I had dinner the other night with some businessmen, and they're all three, they're brothers, and I asked them about poverty, and they all had very different viewpoints. And I was like, are y'all sure y'all were raised in the same house? One said, there's no way to get out of it. Once you're in poverty, you'll never get out of it. If you were born into poverty, you will never come out of it. Well, that right there told me I should quit my job, because if there is no hope, then why am I doing what I'm doing right now? So for me, I love what I do. Our agency is the second largest government agency in the Virgin Islands. We have between 800 and 900 employees, and we serve the entire lifespan, birth until all the way up. So what usually, because of our aging population, like my friend Maria said, that aging population has really taken hold. And there's not enough housing in our community to accommodate that part of the lifespan. So if we focus on the early part of the lifespan, which I feel will solve a lot of issues, our early childhood education, our birth to 5 population, then we will prevent some of the things happening where we are right now. So I will wait for questions as we move forward, but I'm very privileged to be here, and I appreciate very much of the opportunity to share a little bit about the Virgin Islands, what I love, where I live, and my family there. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Commissioner. As I said, the rules set by the debate asked me to skip Dr. Enchautegui in this round. She will be back for more comments. And now, Leticia Peguero from the Nathan Cummings Foundation. I will take a point of personal privilege as the moderator to make sure you go to her bio and notice that she's a graduate of Baruch College of the City University of New York. Great credentials in this panel, but I needed to put my plug. So please proceed.
I wear it proudly. Chancellor. Hi, everyone. I'm honored to be here, though I have to say, if pictures appear on Twitter with me sitting in front of a sign that says Federal Reserve Bank, all my organizer friends are going to disown me. So maybe post pictures of someone else. So my name is Leticia Peguero. I have the pleasure of serving as the Vice President of Programs at the Nathan Cummings Foundation. And I got to know Amanda and the Institute when I was running another foundation called the Andrus Family Fund, and had the pleasure of being one of their initial funders, actually. So I am a big supporter of the work. And as a first generation in Puerto Rican, daughter of Puerto Rican parents, I feel really honored to be here. You know, I'm gonna ask us actually, you know, I'm gonna encourage and invite us to go on a little trip with me, because the perspective that I bring and that the foundation brings is actually one that's deeply rooted in a power and a racial analysis. And so I'll ask us to think a little bit about child poverty from that perspective, if you'll join me. You can say no, but I'm gonna continue talking. So one of the questions that we ask at the Nathan Cummings Foundation is, how does change actually happen, and whose voices need to be involved in order to build a hypothesis grounded in the communities that we serve with an eye toward transformational change? And that has moved us away from funding one-offs and programs that are oftentimes really well liked by people that are interested in a charity-based model of philanthropy. So programs that are about after school, there's nothing wrong with after school programs. And programs that are about tutoring, and there's nothing wrong with tutoring, but from our perspective, this is not going to lead to the transformational change that we want to see, whether that's in Puerto Rico, in the Virgin Islands, in Mobile, Alabama, you know, you name it. So we believe that those closest to the problem have the insight to help us find the solutions. And we believe that places like Puerto Rico, that we do a disservice when we try to solve issues of child poverty without taking a systematic approach that gives us insights into government systems. And in Puerto Rico, you know, I would be remiss if I didn't mention colonial status. I think it's really important as part of how we begin to understand what's happening on the island. And frankly, you know, it would be hard to talk about child poverty in Puerto Rico and the US Virgin Islands if we didn't talk about the disinvestment. And I'll quote my friend Eduardo here, the redlining that philanthropy and that the government has had, right, in Puerto Rico. So at the Nathan Cummings Foundation, we work to reserve generations of generations of concentrated wealth and racialized power and patriarchy to actually get to the root causes of inequality and poverty and to advance racial and economic justice. And we stand with the people, which I think can be really challenging for philanthropy, because the philanthropic model is inherently unequal, right? And was created via systems that didn't really think about transformational power. And I say that as someone who's been working in the system for over a decade. And I think it's important that we at the foundation, and also personally, we believe that philanthropy's old model of funding, again, of charity model of funding program by program or issue by issue without taking historical context and systematic oppression into account is actually not going to lead us to real change on the island or, again, across the United States. And it isn't going to lead us to the transformational work that I think most of us in the audience are here to engage in. So when I think about, on behalf of the foundation, but also in my personal work, when I think about child poverty, my question to everyone here and to my fellow panelists is, what is at the root of what we're talking about when we're talking about child poverty? I mean, children are not poor by themselves, right? Children are part of systems, they're part of families, they're part of inequitable school funding models. They don't exist outside of the neglect of governments, of communities, of philanthropy. Children are part of broader ecosystems, and so what is our responsibility to dream and imagine that the interventions are not just about an after-school program or a one-time scholarship or a particular person's grit. I know grit has a lot, has sort of made its way through the educational literature. And I would be described as someone who grew up poor here as a first generation Puerto Rican, and probably would be described as someone who had a lot of grit, right? I am part of the small percentage of people that exist in a really different economic status than I did when I was growing up. So while that's important, does that lead to the transformational change that we want to see for children? Question mark there. So, I would have us think about what is a clear understanding of the context in which childhood poverty has arisen and is perpetuated, and what are the ethical responsibilities of leaders like myself in philanthropy, in governments, and to think and to dream a little bit about an answer that's deeply rooted in a transformational vision, and a vision that allows and that names, the root causes of what we're talking about.
Thank you, Leticia. So let me begin by a question that I'm going to throw to the entire panel and give each one of you a chance to respond, right? So I am going to be making the bold assumption that if you agree to be in the panel, that you saw the report beforehand and that you are in line with the recommendations of the report, that you believe that the suggestions and the programmatic agenda laid out is a way forward, right? And there might be areas where there's some tweaking, but for the most part, that is a panel that converted of people that believe that the issue is important, that it needs to be put on the forefront, that it needs an investment even at a time of crisis, and that some of the suggestions that were presented in this study present a policy path forward, right? So assuming that that's the case, you all sort of wear different hats, right? There's the philanthropy hat. We have sort of two researchers, academics, engaged. We have someone who is, sort of coming from the governmental sector. How do you see your lanes, if I can put you there, sort of contributing to advancing, making real what the report and the study suggests?
I'm not actually an academic at heart. So anyway,
You can
know,
assume any
I-
identity you
whatever.
want.
Okay, well,
My
here's what I'll-
apologies.
okay,
Right.
That's okay. I'm happy to be in academia. But my first job as a pediatrician in 1971 was as the medical director of the 6 poorest counties in the U.S.'s federally funded clinic. And at that point, I was a Kennedy Johnson kid. I was 26 years old, and I thought, you could do the math, but anyway, I thought that in 10 or 15 years, we would have ended child poverty and certainly had access to health care for everybody. And I proudly told people that it had to be. So now it's almost a half a century later, and things have not changed. Democratic presidents, Republican presidents, Democratic and Republican House of Representatives and Senates, the poverty rate is now it's around 16%. Is that what you said? Class is around 16%. Maybe it goes up to 20%. It drops down a little bit. But we have profound problems that, as far as I'm concerned, are deeply rooted in serious, profound racism and inequity. This is my truth after half a century of working this. The problem is, and I deeply believe this, I don't even care that much, I'm just not going to come out right, about the healthcare specifics. I care about children being successful. That means health, education, social services, and opportunity that's equal to everybody else's opportunity. So my question actually for you is, okay, so let's say we agree on this institutional racism thing. What? For me. For you? Yeah. For you, yeah, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Got lost in my own words here. Yeah, it's a question for you. Do you have thoughts about what exactly are we supposed to do about this, and other than vote in November? But the voting is critically important. Who's leading us is critically important. But my experience is it hasn't made enough difference. We had slavery, we had Jim Crowism, we have institutional racism. It's like hundreds of years of issues that we have to deal with, and I'm not sure how. Are you sure? Do you have a thought?
I have ideas, but I don't know if I'm
talk.
sure.
Yeah, we'll
I
talk.
mean, I would say from a funding perspective. So I'll wear my sort of organizer philanthropic hat. So one, I do think that moving away from a charity-based model, for philanthropy in particular, really does matter. The way that philanthropy was born was, it's a real history in the United States. One, it was a tax shelter, but then two, there was a charity-based model to it. So I do think, and I encourage my philanthropic colleagues, both independent, like people who give of their own wealth, but also institutions to actually root themselves in the history that you're talking about, right? Like, what is the history, so that actually, if we want to address issues of child poverty, we're addressing it from a systemic perspective, right? That we understand that racism is real, that it's here, and that we actually don't want to recreate the systems of inequity, and philanthropy and government can do that over and over again. So I do think, I'm not like a total pessimist. I'm actually, I am a big optimist. I do think that what you're talking about really matters. I would also say that funding organizations that are doing hybrid work, like trying to build power in a community, like trying to build wealth in a community, and addressing the issues that are happening right now, right, really matter. So this notion, and it's the reason why I say, can we move away from, there's nothing wrong with some of the one-offs, but what is it that we're trying to build here? What is the democracy that we're trying to have our children live in? Because if what we're trying to do is create different systems, we actually have to start today.
I think what we did in the report and the way we are looking at poverty in Puerto Rico is from a capabilities perspective. To the point that poverty truncate the opportunities of children. And so we are providing a very quite comprehensive agenda, because we think one thing, by one only thing, will not possibly solve the problem. So we have to be very more comprehensive in what we, how we approach poverty. From that perspective, that we produce, I mean, we propose a multiple solutions. From this perspective, I think that when you have a very big problem, usually it's the result of many different things, and we started to kind of break that problem in pieces and try to tackle that problem from different angles. And in Puerto Rico, we think that it's important to remove barriers. I mean, that even if we have jobs, a lot of the women that are in poverty will not able to access this job because there are too many barriers. So it's not only about creating the jobs, it's only providing a tax system that could provide the job, reinventing into transforming the way the social services work. So they focus more in the development, in the human development of these families rather than just in a factory of going and giving a check to a person, that they care more. I mean, what we are seeing in some interventions we are looking at is very simple. It's amazing how much difference you can make when you really care. I mean, when the people that are in the other side of the desk, I mean, the service providers really care about your well-being and your development. So we are providing a more comprehensive approach because we think that only one thing doesn't make, is not going to solve the problem.
Hello? So the intentional part, I think, is really important. And what's interesting, because human services is not the system, it's part of the system. And I think that that's an interesting perspective because in a child's life, it's not just human services. We're the safety net. We come in at the end usually, or we're coming in to provide SNAP or TANF or child care subsidy or Head Start. And what happens is that as soon as you start making some money, you're working and you're really trying, really want to do the right thing, and you really want to make your family better. And as soon as you do, your eligibility starts to cut and then you can't make it. So the system, like you were talking about, is kind of like, it doesn't allow for success and it doesn't allow for you to really come out of it. I've noticed in the Virgin Islands too is that it's generational, and it's hard to break the cycle of child abuse and neglect, because that is a tie-in for poverty too, is that I've noticed that you'll have great-grandmother and then grandmother and then mom and then now child all in the same similar circumstances because that cycle has not been broken. So unless we intervene in order to break that cycle, whether it be poverty or child abuse and neglect or whatever you want to call it, we're not going to make that difference. And so concerted efforts could be a pilot project in a neighborhood or an area and provide all the services in the neighborhood, but have buy-in from that community, where you have those community members that take charge of their community and want to make a difference, and then put all that. That's when you start making the difference of institutional change and intentional change. You can do it as a system, but if you start doing it smaller and doing community by community, I feel like the change will happen. It will be very slow, but it'll be generational changes, which I think is what's needed.
So thank you. That's a perfect segue, because I wanted to ask, again, each one of you, based on your different perspectives and trajectories, and the class sort of was very good at providing some faces and examples of the kids. And, you know, he mentioned that he was asked to give us stories, right? Because we're going to get a policy prescription. And if I can follow on that thought about sort of the two-generation strategies to be able to address sort of breaking the cycle of intergenerational poverty, which I think speaks to many of the things that all of you in the panel have mentioned in different ways. Do you have specific either examples of, you know, sort of in the vein of optimism and marching orders and things that work so that we can replicate that we want to share with the audience along those lines of things that have been effective, that maybe we can, that either might be examples from Puerto Rico that we want to expand and replicate, or they're coming from other places that might be helpful in this trajectory?
I'll start. The
Yeah, no,
early
this is-
childhood
this
initiative.
is for the panel. This
Okay.
is,
So early childhood initiatives are crucial. So your early Head Start into your Head Start programs, because early Head Start goes from pregnancy. So it's not just as soon as a child's born. It takes the pregnant and parenting part of it and pulls it through to a birth to 3 population. And then you're supporting them so your low birth weights are not going to happen. You're supporting during the pregnancy, so you're going to have healthier pregnancies, which means healthier children. And I think that if you start from that early stages and bring it through, I ran a teenage pregnancy program, and it was through Catholic Charities, and it was interesting that I couldn't talk about sex education. So I was like, okay, so you have a child, but I'm not allowed to talk about birth control. So how do you break that cycle? You provide education, you provide childcare, and make sure that they were successful. That's how you break it. You provided the resources they needed to come out of it. And so I think that if we do the early childhood, birth to 5, birth to 6, support that, put our arms around it, I think that would be good. We do have early Head Start, and which needs to be expanded, by the way, and Head Start.
We know a lot already about what works in job training. For Puerto Rico in particular, we don't have a lot of information, but we know what the elements of a successful job training programs are. We know that we have to focus in growing industry, that we have you have to engage the private sector, that 1 week training doesn't work, that has to be more intensive. So we know what are the elements, and we have examples. There are examples of what kind of programs work. What we are trying to do is to make sure that the agencies that are doing those trainings in Puerto Rico follow those guidelines. We also are getting a lot of good information about what is happening in one example of a school on 2-generation models. And we also know from the literature that intensive casework works. if you follow these families and you do it a lot of companionship, and care about them and call them and develop a relationship. We know that works. And what the early outcomes we are seeing in one school where this is being applied is quite promising.
Well, the things that could be done and should be done, it's not a menu where you could say this one or that one. It really has to be everything simultaneously. Early childhood investments, et cetera, et cetera. But as far as my understanding of the literature is concerned, there's nothing like money to end poverty. So raising the minimum wage, increasing the early EITC money, if that alone would go a long way to alleviating poverty. And if you couple that with the appropriate early intervention programs and quality schools, you actually have a shot of fixing this. Is that more or less what people think? And yeah, that's what I think. So, but people are nodding, so it must be more or less correct, right? So yeah, so it's money, and the money is related to the politics. And this is where the importance of engagement in making sure that the leaders that we elect agree with this very basic notion. Money helps alleviate poverty. So we either have to make that a priority or not. And I would be assessing the potential candidates for presidency, for members of the Congress, et cetera, based on what do they think about that. Do you agree with that? Because we're going to be counting on you to accomplish that if we elect you.
So, I'm always fascinated, being on panels about poverty, because it's like it's this thing that no one talks about where it comes from or what it's a byproduct of. So it's this sort of amorphous thing that we, that we're trying to solve, but we're sort of beating around the bush, right, about what it is. So, I appreciate your comments. From our perspective, we fund workers' rights and defense work through one of our portfolios, Racial and Economic Justice. And from our perspective, a lot of those organizations do 2-generation strategies. And so it's this idea of, for example, the National Domestic Workers Alliance it's gone from, you know, a really small group of women here in New York to actually an international. And Aijin Pu, who started it, you know, has been at the Oscars and sort of become a really well-known person. But this idea that if you improve worker conditions for, in this case, mostly women and mostly women of color, that it actually has a really big impact on their children, because women are generally, not all the time, sorry to the dads in the audience, but women are mostly the caretakers of the children. And so then how do we, both from a policy perspective, protect workers, in this case, low-income women? How do we think about their children and think about daycare and think about like what's needed for the women to be able to do their work? And then how do we push from a policy perspective to raise the minimum wage and to be able to make sure that there's, you know, healthcare, or New York, for example, passed sick day, right? Like the notion that their domestic workers would not have been able to take a sick day in 2019 is amazing. And so I think for an organization like NDWA to push both, you know, equitable salaries, minimum wage, childcare, and then policy work, from my perspective, is one of the ways that we, you know, can address poverty and what it's a byproduct of.
Thank you. So let's stay in this money, the need for money thread, and see where we go with that. And I wanted to connect it a little bit with, let's say, the charge that I think we all will have at the end of this panel, right? To embrace this agenda and to move it forward in the context of Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands. No, don't worry, I was going to go there, and other places. But so it's the side of the advocacy and the work that needs to be done to be able to get the money, right? And as someone who spent the day yesterday lobbying in Albany for money for higher ed, which everybody agrees that is one of the best investments that you can do to have a prosperous, right? The rest of the script, which is similar to the way in which the study here gets framed, right? About at a time of crisis in Puerto Rico, not a lot of resources, unless we make an investment in child poverty and we make it part of the picture, there's not going to be significant progress, right? But you often run, when you're doing those things, into the reality of government, philanthropy, and other spaces sort of believing in a zero-sum game. Yeah? This is the pot, right? And it needs to be divided in X number of ways. And I might agree that it's an investment, but where against what do I take that investment? So based on all your experience, your work, and with different hats here, how do we move the agenda of advocacy so that we can get the money and the resources that implementing different components of this plan will need? So I put the Jeopardy music of waiting.
Just asking is always the first way. You can't get a yes unless you ask, correct? And I think that you also need to know what you're asking for. And so for the Virgin Islands, it's always been an inequitable distribution of resources for the Virgin Islands. We've always had that. We've had it for a very long time, and it's pressed us, and it's current. 30% of children are living in poverty in the Virgin Islands. Not 16%, 30%. That's almost a third of our population. And so for me, that's very heavy. But I think if we just begin by asking, right? But when you ask, we had this conversation earlier, if I'm going to ask you for $1, I want it to be impactful, right? If I'm asking you for money, or some kind of investment, it needs to make sure that it's going to be effectual change, not just covering it, making icing on the top.
And right now, for instance, in the tax code of the United States, they give trillions of dollars to children. mainly of possibly middle class and higher. I mean, you have a tax exemption for every dependent child. So that is, I mean, so we are giving money for people that have kids now. We're just not giving it to people, possibly the poor people. We're just giving it to middle class and higher class. So there is some systems out there that we are being using that maybe we could rethink about some redistribution of those systems where we can give more direct money. I mean, some work that I have read from the United States regarding cash allowance for children, they are kind of rethinking. So maybe if you take all these other tax breaks that you give for children and all that stuff, and maybe you just give it in a lump sum money every month. So there is a lot of monies out there that are being given, but we don't think of them in that way.
So I agree with Dr. Irwin. I think what you said earlier about the political, well, one, kind of don't boo, vote, right? Like, it's a big election year. But I also think that that it's really hard to address the issue of, advocating for a more equal distribution without talking about the system within which you're advocating in, and and talking about the fact that there's, we're living in one of the most unequal times in American history. And so I think there is, at least from groups on the ground, how we support them is thinking about what is the data that people need to be able to advocate effectively. How do we support organizations like El Instituto that actually gather data on youth justice issues and other issues in Puerto Rico that there aren't lots of other places that are doing that, right? And so it is really important. I think from a university perspective, part of what CUNY does is gather data, but how does a group that's working in los caseríos in Puerto Rico, how do they gather that information to be able to, one, be rooted in the information and also be able to advocate for it, and also just to, I would say, to lift the hood of, the sort of 24 hours news cycle does a wonderful job of obscuring some of what's actually going on, or you have to be like a news junkie like me and follow it. So I do think that there's, how do we support the organizations that are actually working on behalf of equity, to be able to do the work that they need to do. It's hard work. I think it's possible, but I do think asking ourselves again, how do we move away from a charity-based model to a model that is about impacting long-term change?
So I very much agree with you, and I think the challenge now of doing charitable work or philanthropy or giving money to organizations that are doing things is really, it's critical that you think about it in the way that you're thinking about it. But at the end of the day, first of all, there's data and there's data. We do not need one more study about the impact of poverty on children or what children need in the first 5 or 10 years of life. We don't do another study of that nature. We have the information. The question is, what do we do with the information we have? Who do we talk to about it? We do annual, Visit the Hill Day in Washington we're bringing, 50 or 60 people from around the country from our Children's Health Funds programs. We have, 75 visits with members of Congress. They've had 3 such visits before us. They'll have 3 more after us. And if the audience is not receptive to the data, to the advocacy, then what are we doing? I've spent a lot of time with the Republican senators in particular, and they nod, they're usually friendly, but they don't actually care. And they're not about to be influenced by the data that we're bringing them or the stories that we're telling them. They're just not. They have other priorities, and I would like them to go away and replace them with people who will listen to us. Basically, that's what it comes down to. Now, my wife and I are we're in a position and a stage and age where we're going to take off from July through November 9th or 3rd, whatever it is, and work on that issue. That's my agenda. And I hope as many of you who can understand this fundamental point. There's no sense beating around the bush about this. You are not going to get anywhere with the things that we want with the White House and the Senate in control of who controls those organizations. I mean, we all know that, don't we? Or, yeah. So that's what I'm talking about. Still, you still have to take money and give it to organizations who are doing things that are necessary. But at the end of the day, my family's choice is knocking on doors or something. Thank you.
Well, and if anybody wants to join you in those 6 months, they can contact you at irwinredlener.com and join you in they can. But so I think that issue of advocacy is important, because you're talking about educating, in this case, the elected officials. There is some work to be done in terms of educating those who influence the elected officials to act, right? And how do you get, how do you make this issue, right, something also, I mean, it's obviously something that the individual voters and the people in the community care about, right? Because they care about their children, they care about, and how do you use that in a way that trickles, right? In terms of the circles of power, to be able to change the way that money is allocated, the way that decisions are made, right? I don't think that in that sense that's not a tough story to tell or to sell in the individual lives of people. So it might not be as easy when you are dealing with the immediate lobbying, so again, I just want to put that question, and maybe a different way to put it also is, clearly, Puerto Rico's in a very, on the Virgin Islands. Let me make sure that I do that. Very, very, very difficult moment. I think is a moment where there is that desire to identify the path that are going to lead to prosperity. Yes, got it. To prosperity and to change and to transformation. And I think people are really yearning for that and trying to find what that's going to be. And the challenge for us is to insert, right, this component as a fundamental part of that agenda. I mean, it's clearly laid out in the study. So, how do we do that day to day? And sort of maybe quick answers, then we go to Q&A from the public, or you can blatantly disregard my question and say something you really wanted to say all the time, and I didn't give you the chance to do it, and I'm happy with that too.
So, I used to think that children were sacred, right? Like in the public narrative. And I don't know that anymore. I worry that, it was what's happening at the border, right? That has made me feel that maybe in the American mindset that children are no longer sacred. And so that worries me, both from a child poverty perspective, but just in terms of what that means about us as a people. Like, what does it mean to see those images and for, most of us to not be up in arms about what's happening there? So with that said, I think that sort of sets a framework as we think about issues of child poverty in the United States, in the Virgin Islands, in Puerto Rico, that it's, from my perspective, an uphill battle. Because if children are no longer sacred, then geez, what is, right? And the only other thing I'll say is, every panel that I've ever spoken on, I've wanted like this hashtag to like take hold, and it never does. So I'm gonna try one more time. Because I do believe that there is another way, right? That like there is actually another way of engaging in capitalism. There is another way of thinking about this work. And so the hashtag was otra forma, never took hold. Feel free to tweet it. But this idea of another way in Spanish, but this idea that that there's actually another way, that maybe because we're like within the system, we actually can't see it. But could there be another way for Puerto Rico or the Virgin Islands to really think about prosperity that doesn't involve the system that has so choked it, right, and kept it out of, out of its ability, right, for ownership and prosperity?
To have politicians that are running for whatever position they're running to talk about poverty. Everybody wants to talk about prosperity. Nobody wants to talk about poverty. And I think, some of the things that I believe is, first, we have to, in Puerto Rico specifically, we have to stop thinking about the poor as the other. We have looked at data that most Puerto Ricans are one paycheck away from being poor. If you lost your job for a month, you will be falling into poverty. So we are much more closer to being poor than what most people think. So this is not something that affects the other. So we have to stop thinking about poverty, the poor person at the other, because that could be us anytime. We're also asking questions. We have to keep asking the question too. Everywhere, bring it up everywhere, be loud about it. Partner with, for journalists, for instance, that ask this question whenever they see the people that are running for office. But we have to keep this issue in the agenda and be loud about it.
I'm so glad you said loud, because I really feel like we're not loud enough. And the advocacy is like it goes back to intentional, and who do you be loud with? And how do you know that they're the right people to be loud with? And I think that is really kind of questionable for me. I'm supposed to be here, policy commissioner here, and it's unfortunate that I'm like here sometimes because of the fires that we have to put out on a regular basis. And it clouds my mind when there's so much here that I'm not able to be advocate and loud. And so I'm really glad that I've been here and listened, because now I'm really going to go back with that energy of being loud, which I can be very loud. My children can tell me that I can be loud. But I need to be loud and advocate for the Virgin Islands, because that's what we're here for. And that's what we need to do. And I think if we continue to do that, then the change will come. But it's going to take a minute.
I just want to make a quick comment about this assumption that America cared about children. They cared about some children, not children of color particularly. It's not a shred of evidence to suggest or support the notion that we care about all children. We kind of care about our own children most of the time. 2012, a lunatic, killed a bunch of kids in an elementary school in Connecticut with guns that never should have had. And we kind of cared about that in the news cycles that followed. And have we done anything to control this insane gun situation in America? I'm not talking about eliminating them. I'm talking about the so-called common sense gun laws. So I don't know. Is there data that America cares about children, all children? No. I don't think so. But anyway.
So
that was a downer.
That's a perfect segue into the Q&A. Do we have a mic in the audience for the folks with the questions? So the rules will be keep the questions short. I'm going to take 2 or 3 and then bring it back to the panel. I think that's more efficient. And if you're going to try to sneak in a comment that is not a question, have the elegance and the smarts to frame it in the form of a question, and keep it tight. So here in the front.
Good afternoon, Mary Torres. I have a direct connection to Puerto Rico. My family lives there, and they've been blowing up my phone with about 36 questions, so I'm going to keep it to one. So talking about prosperity in lieu of poverty, in Puerto Rico, the youth right now, people graduating college, prosperity and away from poverty is coming to the mainland. So what do you see as a policy or economic incentives to help keep those young people in Puerto Rico and keep them on the Virgin Islands? Because they're leaving. Clearly, Maria, your statistics show that they're leaving the island. So what are we doing to keep them there?
So that's the first question. Thank you.
There's one already in the back.
Yes, go.
Hi, Anthony Santiago. I'm with the National League of Cities Institute for Youth Education and Families. We're celebrating 20 years of working with local policymakers doing this work. How do you find pilots and bring them to other municipalities that could replicate? So my question is, and I'm sorry, I don't think in the Virgin Islands there are cities, and my families are son de lares. What local examples and what role can mayors play in helping further this work? We talked a lot about federal policies, but we spend a lot of time bringing mayors together and their staff together to learn from each other to bring, those local examples. So there's things that can be done on the local policy level that furthers this agenda. I'd love to hear, if there are examples of that in Puerto Rico, and if not, how can we, better address it?
One more there. Yep.
Question was, countries that have reduced childhood poverty, what have they done? And looking at statistics, it looks like they spend more, their federal governments spend much more money to reduce it. How do we get to that place? How do we get to a place where we have a successful policy, in other words, where the money's not wasted on a successful basis? What would everyone's idea on that be?
Okay, so let me take the three questions. If we have more time, we'll take some more. We have a variation of the money question sort of coming back, and what do we know of places that have been successful in eradicating or really minimizing child poverty? What role can mayors play in that sort of sphere of policy? And then the question about how do we keep young people from leaving the island? What kinds of incentives do we create so that, some of that chart that we saw about the population decline and the changing demographics does not occur. So open to whoever wants to take any form of them.
I didn't hear well the last question.
So the last question was what can we learn from places that have done a good job at decreasing child poverty, eradicating? He mentioned that probably they're putting money into it, but sort of wise use of money and that kind of example.
Well, in terms of the exodus of the young people, we at the Institute are working with a group of different agencies, a multi-sectoral group, to focus on young parents and how we can improve the opportunities of young parents that have children. Because this group decided that this was a group to focus on because the immediacy of the need to retain these young people in Puerto Rico. They have passed a lot of incentive. I was talking to my research assistant that she's 25, and she told me, no, I don't have to pay any taxes. They just recently passed a law a couple of years ago where they reduced significantly the income taxes on young people. But we know that what keep or not young people in Puerto Rico as opportunities, and then they look into the future, right? We're not doing a lot of work on immigration, but here is Edwin Melendez and the center who has been producing that work, and you can look at what they are doing, because we really think that this is the cross, keeping that people in Puerto Rico to reduce the population drain in Puerto Rico. In terms of local, the way the government in Puerto Rico is structured is very different from state government here. So there is much less but actions that mayors can take. For instance, education is centralized, so it's not at the local level. A lot of the taxes are also not at the local level. There are some opportunities there that we have identified, for instance, from the CDBG-R money whenever this money comes, where they will have a lot of opportunities there to bring some space-based policies in these areas. But really, the way the government is structured doesn't give a lot of tools to local governments.
You know, I want to say something about what exists in Puerto Rico that's extremely positive for those of you who may not spend a lot of time there. It's an extraordinary place. There are extraordinary organizations. There's an organization that's a chain of community health centers called SIM, which may be it is recognized as one of the best community health center networks in the entire United States. It's extraordinary. Amanda Rivera's foundation, it's incredible. The Boys and Girls Clubs of Puerto Rico are spectacular. So there's plenty of examples of programs that work and do great work. The problem is there, as it is here, the process of scaling up, of taking that example and replicating it elsewhere, is something that we develop acute paralysis around. We can't do it. You know, there's some countries, I'm going to oversimplify this, but in France, many years ago, when they realized that early education is important, the studies were done, it's important. Now it's everywhere. It just exists. Why? The government of France was receptive. Try to take that away, you're going to have a hell of a problem. There's criticism about the National Health Service in the United Kingdom. But you can't take that away. I don't care what place on the political spectrum leadership is, that's not going anywhere. It's considered an entitlement, as should be the examples that you know about in City A that should be replicated everywhere else, and increasing the income with EITC and as I was talking about before, the minimum wage and so on. So there's plenty of things to be replicated in Puerto Rico by Puerto Ricans. It's just like everywhere else. It's why don't we know how to do that? Do you know?
I don't. But I'll just speak to the role of philanthropy in Puerto Rico, because it's a space that I know fairly well. That in the United States, in the mainland United States, philanthropic institutions have served very particular roles, including over the past 20 years with a shift away from more traditional philanthropy to actually catalyzing some pretty innovative work around young people, around anti-incarceration movements, around advocacy, and there's a national context for it. So for example, in New Orleans, post-Hurricane Katrina, philanthropy went in and helped with infrastructure, and then local philanthropy actually wouldn't fund, for a whole host of reasons, advocacy and organizing. And so the national funders came in to say, like, okay, great, like we're gonna fund the advocacy and the organizing that's gonna help change potential systems. In Puerto Rico, the philanthropic bodies are just, it's a really different space. And so post-Hurricane Maria, actually, there's some things that have cropped up that have been working actually locally with some of the mayors in a way that didn't exist before. And so right now there's something called La Red de Fundaciones de Puerto Rico, which is what we call here a regional association. So there are some changes to the way that the philanthropic sector works in terms of funding, but in terms of like catalyzing like local economic engines, which is something that philanthropy does here, that's actually at a really nascent stage in Puerto Rico in a way that I think, it's not that I don't believe it can't happen, it's just at a really different place of development. So when we understand trying to answer the question of like, how can philanthropy do things that it does here, I think it'll take a little bit more time, but also really thinking about, could there be a way that philanthropy in Puerto Rico, again, doesn't have to follow the model of the United States, but can create its own way of catalyzing economic growth and other things.
I'm not sure if I have anything to add necessarily, but like we're in budget cycle right now, so we're creating our budget, and I put this as a challenge. I said, okay, so you've been doing your budget for several years the same way. What would happen if you created it from scratch? So you've looked at your trends over the last several years and how you've been spending your money. And I'm only going to give you, let's just say one program, I give you $100. If you had to create it and didn't have a box to do it in, what would it look like? So I think that we need to start challenging ourselves to stop always thinking this is the way it should be versus creating it. So back to basics, let's look at what it would look like if I could create it in my own head. Like, what would human services look like if I didn't have all of those parameters around it, and creating what I need, not what I necessarily have right now. So I don't know if that answered anybody's question, but it was my challenge to my administrators. I'm like, y'all need to start thinking very creatively and stop thinking so systematically in a box.
So thank you. So we are coming towards the end. So what I want to do, because even though I'm in an administrative role now, the teacher in me has never died, right? So I would like for all of you to have like a sort of last remark, brief, and try to frame it to the audience in the form of homework, right? I mean, to give a charge to the audience here. We've all committed. We all believe that this is important. We all believe that it's indispensable for the long-term viability of the island of Puerto Rico and the islands that make up the Virgin Islands. So what homework, what charge would you give the audience, and I guess we're being filmed, all those who will be watching us in posterity?
Come visit the Virgin Islands. I have to put a plug in. Sometimes you have to see it to feel it. And so I would encourage you to visit on vacation or do something. Take 6 months off and come and just work. I mean, I think that would be a great way to do it. I think if you can come and see really what it looks like and and I think that would be a really important aspect of it, because sometimes if you give without seeing, you're not really knowing what the impact is going to be when you do give.
Say to think about child poverty not only in terms of the consequences it has for their children and their families, which are humongous, but also in terms of the long-term consequences that it has for the future of Puerto Rico.
So Dr. King is quoted as saying the arc of justice is long. The arc, what is it? It's long and it bends towards justice. I think it doesn't bend toward justice on its own, so I will invite you all to do your part to make sure that it bends towards justice.
Well, me? Upbeat? Yeah. I think you probably could guess what I think is the most important thing to do, so I'm not going to reiterate it, but anything you could do to help change the audience for these advocacy messages is what we need to do now. There's just no two ways about it. And not everybody can take time off. I'm being, obviously you all can't. But whatever you can do, please do it.
So I think that we want to thank the Federal Reserve Bank for hosting us. We want to thank the Youth Development Institute for the work that they do, the study, and convening us. And I ask all of you to give a big round of applause to our panelists. Thank you.